It's all right. He won't hurt you.
What would you do if one day you discovered your father was secretly raising something that wasn't human? In the remote forests of Trinity County, 1981, an 8-year-old boy named Daniel returns to his childhood home, only to find a baby Bigfoot hiding behind the old wooden pantry. But here's the truth no one expected. Bigfoot exists, and it was raised like a child by a quiet, grieving veterinarian who couldn't bring himself to let it die. The twist, the person who reported it to the police, was Daniel's estranged mother, the same woman who once abandoned them with a bitter goodbye letter. Sounds like fantasy? It's not. This is a story about love that transcends species, about healing old wounds through compassion. I've spent 7 years studying the world's most moving stories about humans and the monsters we fear. And nothing has stayed with me like this one. Stick around and you'll see how a wild creature saved a boy's life. Why his father whispered, "Now that you're home, my heart is whole again." And how one boy learned that empathy matters more than blood. Daniel, now a grown man, still returns to that forest, leaving behind a small piece of carved wood beneath the twin oaks where they buried Junior. No tears, no fear, just quiet gratitude for a creature no one believed could love. If you think monsters are meant to be destroyed, watch this. Because in the next 5 minutes, you'll never look at Bigfoot the same way again. There was a smell in the barn that Daniel had come to know. Not the sharp bite of manure or the warm musk of hay, but something older, quieter, like wood soaked with years, sweat from animals and men, and the thick, patient breath of dust. He stood on the edge of it all, boots barely holding on to his 7-year-old feet, watching the slow movement of his father's hands inside the heaving belly of a cow that couldn't seem to finish giving birth. Frank said nothing. He never did during moments like this. The man worked like the silence itself, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, brow lined and shining, whispering calm into a world split between life and death. The cow moaned low, deep from her ribs, legs trembling. Daniel held the lantern up with both hands, arms shaking a little. His father's voice finally came like a thread of gravel. "There you go, sweetheart. One more push." And then there was the wet slap of something new on straw. Frank leaned back, holding a steaming calf in his hands. And for a moment, Daniel didn't breathe. Not until Frank turned. One side of his face lit gold, and smiled. "You did good, kiddo." The sun was already low when they rode home in the truck. It wasn't much of a truck anymore. The paint was peeling like sunburn, and the engine stuttered over every hill. But Daniel sat tall beside his father, covered in straw, proud. They passed the old orchard where the apples dropped too early. They passed the hitching posts where horses still called out, and where the sound of their hooves echoed faint under the long hush of fog creeping in from the edge of the valley. In Trinity County, the seasons didn't just change. They pressed into you. They crept under doorways and into your bones. That spring had come late, and the summer that followed it clung too tight. The roads bled dust. The trees whispered too early. Frank always made one more stop before supper. Sometimes it was a bag of feed for the Baldwin Ranch. Sometimes it was just a visit with Old Man Tuck, who'd lost his wife and barely spoke. And sometimes, like today, it was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, half a thermos of coffee, and a quiet walk to the back of a church where a man with no name sat under the stairs. Daniel saw his father kneel down and hand the food over like it was an offering. No words, no looks, just that quiet, practiced kindness that never asked for thanks. Later, when Daniel asked why they didn't call the shelter instead, Frank just said, "Son, sometimes saving a man ain't about fixing his whole life. Sometimes it's just making sure he eats that day." Evenings in their home were always soft around the edges. The house itself was no more than an old timber frame with mismatched windows and a wood stove that coughed when the wind hit wrong. But it had a rhythm to it. The way Frank scraped his boots off on the porch twice. The way Daniel helped set out 3 plates, though only 2 were used. The way Frank read to him from dog-eared books with voices that rumbled and cracked in all the right places. The way the soup always tasted like someone tried their best, even when there wasn't much in it. But Martha had begun to fade around the corners of the house. You could feel it. The way she stirred her coffee too long. The way she looked out the window even when it was dark and there was nothing to see. She stopped coming to barn calls. She stopped listening to the stories about calves born backward or ponies that kicked. She stopped laughing at the way Frank sang off key while doing dishes. Daniel didn't understand the words she said when she thought he couldn't hear. All he ever cares about are his damn animals. One night she slammed the door so hard a picture fell off the wall. Daniel stood frozen. Frank picked up the frame, set it back without a word, and went to fix the fence like he always did. That fall, the days turned brittle. The leaves lost their color too fast, like they'd given up early. The air smelled like burnt wood and old water. One night, sometime in late October, Daniel woke up thirsty. He padded into the kitchen, rubbing one eye, and stopped cold. The table was bare. No thermos, no cereal box, no plates waiting for the morning. Just a single piece of paper under the empty mug. He couldn't read it all, but the words he could read hit like cold river stones. I can't do this anymore. You care more about dogs and cows than your own wife. Don't come looking for me. He stood there for a long time. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was hollow, like the house had exhaled and didn't bother breathing in again. Frank didn't come in right away. Daniel didn't move. Somewhere far away, a coyote called once and went quiet. The boy folded the note and slipped it into his pajama pocket. He didn't know why, only that something inside him said this was the kind of thing you kept, even if it hurt. The next morning, Frank made eggs. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just poured 2 cups of coffee and sat beside his son in the quiet. Then he said, "We'll be all right." But the words were bent, like they'd gone through too much to come out straight. After that, there were still animals to help, fences to mend, neighbors to check on. Frank kept going like a man walking uphill into wind, head low, shoulders stubborn. And Daniel followed him, quiet and small, but watching everything. Watching the way his father still knelt beside a wounded dog, still kissed the old mare on the nose after pulling a thorn from her hoof, still offered his last piece of bread to a stranger. There was something sacred in the way Frank moved through the world, even if nobody else saw it. One day they went to a far ranch where a horse had slipped down a gully and couldn't stand. It had rained the night before. The ground was thick and sweet with mud. Daniel helped carry the pack with bandages and salve. The horse's leg was bad, maybe bad enough that the owner whispered about putting her down. But Frank just touched her neck and said, "Let me try." 3 hours later, she was standing. Limping, but standing. Daniel had never seen a man so tired. Frank just wiped the sweat from his neck, looked at the sky, and said, "That'll do." That night, Daniel sat on the floor while Frank read a story about a boy who could talk to birds. The boy in the book was lonely too. When the chapter ended, Daniel leaned against his father's leg. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Frank's hand rested on his head and stayed there for a long time. The stove popped in the corner. The wind pushed against the window like it wanted in. In the weeks that followed, Daniel started going everywhere with his father. Not because he had to, but because being close made the cold feel less sharp. He learned how to tie knots that held, how to check a hoof for rot, how to tell when an animal wasn't just sick, but scared. He learned to read silence, to feel the difference between being alone and being left. Martha never called. No postcards, no apologies. Frank never said her name again. He folded the bed sheets and gave her coat to the Goodwill, Daniel never asked. He just kept that note in a drawer under his socks, like a splinter too deep to dig out. Fall turned to winter. The air got thin and sharp, and a frost curled along the porch railings. Frank started sleeping less, staying up to patch up fence lines or write notes on yellow pads he never threw away. Sometimes Daniel heard him in the kitchen after midnight, talking low to the dog like it understood. That December, on a day when the sky hung heavy and low, Frank came home smelling like pine and said, "We got one more stop." They drove out past the pasture, up a trail Daniel didn't know. At the edge of the woods, Frank killed the engine and got out, pulling a nylon bag from under the seat. Inside it, sandwiches, jerky, a piece of flannel, a tin of something Daniel didn't recognize. "Stay close," Frank said. Daniel did. They walked until the trees got thick and the light turned gray. That's when Daniel noticed it. The fence post broken clean, the marks in the mud, the odd shape near the shed behind the old cabin. Frank moved without fear, as if this had been routine for years. He opened the door. At first, Daniel thought it was a bear cub, but the way it moved, arms folded close, knees tucked, head tilted like it was listening, it wasn't a bear. It was smaller than a man, but taller than a child, covered in soft brown fur, thin in places, patches of skin showing around its wrists. Its eyes were black, too black, like wet stone. It blinked once, then slowly reached out a hand. Frank didn't flinch. He crouched low, held out a sandwich. The creature sniffed, then grabbed it fast and pressed it close. Its breathing was ragged. When Frank reached into the bag again, Daniel took a step forward. The thing froze. Daniel saw its eyes flick to him, and then, after a long, still second, it reached forward again. This time, not for the food. For him. Daniel held his breath. The hand touched his wrist, feather-light. Then it gripped, just once. Not hard, not scared. Like it needed to know he was real. Frank looked up, face unreadable. "This is Junior," he said softly. "He's been alone a long time." Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. But his heart did something strange. It didn't race. It opened. The sky outside darkened, but inside that little wooden shed, something lit up. 3 shadows knelt in the straw, man, boy, and something else entirely. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel didn't feel small. He felt found. And though he couldn't have explained it then, some part of him understood that love wasn't always about where you came from. Sometimes it was about who you stayed for. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite the skin. It settled behind your eyes, in your lungs, somewhere deep where grief hides. Seattle in winter had no softness, no forgiving light. The buildings all leaned gray against a gray sky. The rain felt like punishment, and nothing ever dried. Not really. The apartment they lived in was 3 floors above a broken laundromat, next to a Vietnamese takeout place that smelled like burned fish oil and cheap soap. Daniel, barely 10, sat by the window most days, his chin against the fogged glass, watching buses shudder through slush and people move like shadows with places to be that didn't include him. Martha had changed since Trinity. Her voice, once worn but warm, had grown sharp. Words clipped, movements fast, always carrying a scent of something burnt behind her. A match just snuffed out, a door just slammed. She wore thick eyeliner now, spoke in half-truths and whispers to people Daniel never met. They moved apartments 3 times in 2 years. She said they were running from mistakes, but she never said whose. She told Daniel his father didn't care, that he chose animals over people, that he let them leave without so much as chasing the car. Sometimes she'd cry about it, mostly when the lights were off. But other times she'd just say, "You'll understand when you're older," as if growing would make the hurt make sense. There was no dog anymore, no barn, no stories at bedtime. Just the flicker of a TV with the sound turned low and Daniel trying to memorize the layout of every room in case they had to leave again. At school, he stayed quiet. Other kids talked about baseball, parents, birthday parties. He kept to himself, drawing fences on the margins of his notebook. Just long lines of wood, post after post, going nowhere. Then one morning in early January, everything shattered. A knock at the door. Not the kind you answer. The kind that says things are already too late. Men in jackets with letters on their backs. Words he didn't understand. His mother screaming. A plastic bag full of pill bottles. A quiet voice explaining what would happen next. Daniel didn't cry. He just stood there, arms crossed, as a woman with soft eyes and hard shoes knelt down and said they'd find a place for him. A place with other kids. Until someone figured things out. The ride out of Seattle was long. The woman tried to talk, tried to ask about his favorite color, what foods he liked, if he had any allergies. Daniel stared out the window, watched the city give way to trees, trees to fields, fields to hills. When the sun dropped low, she finally said, "We found someone." He didn't answer. She handed him a paper cup of juice at a gas station and said they were almost there, that she was sorry. It wasn't until they turned off the main road into Trinity County that something shifted in him. The way the mist curled around the trees, the way the light fell gold across the fences, it all felt like waking from a long, bad dream. The truck rumbled down a gravel path lined with cedar, past a broken fence Daniel knew by heart. Then, there it was. The porch with its uneven boards. The wood pile still covered in a blue tarp. A metal watering can left near the steps, right where it always was. And Frank, standing in the yard. At first, Daniel didn't move. The woman called out, but he didn't hear her. Not really. He just stared at the man who had once lifted calves from the womb and read him stories about dragons. The man whose shoulders seemed smaller now, whose beard was grayer. Frank's eyes locked on his, and for one terrifying moment, neither moved. Then Frank walked forward. Not fast, not slow, just steady, until he was close enough to kneel and put his arms around the boy he hadn't seen in over 2 years. Daniel didn't mean to cry. He really didn't. But the smell of wood smoke and hay and that soap Frank always used, God, it cracked him open. He sobbed into the old coat, the one still patched at the elbow, and Frank just held him, tighter and tighter, like if he let go now, the whole world might split in two. He never said her name. Not once. That night, the house was warm. The same wood stove. The same chipped mugs. Frank made stew that tasted like memories. They didn't talk much. Daniel kept looking around, as if expecting something to have changed. But it hadn't. Not really. Even the creak in the hallway floor was still there. After dinner, Frank threw another log on the fire, poured himself a small glass of something, and leaned back in the chair that had always been too big for him. Daniel sat on the rug, legs crossed. He stared at the flames until Frank said, soft like gravel under rain, "You're home now. That's all that matters." Daniel looked up. "Are you mad at her?" Frank didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip, eyes distant. "No," he said finally. "I'm just glad you're safe." Then silence again. But it wasn't hollow this time. It was full of all the things they didn't need to say. Before bed, Daniel brushed his teeth with the same blue toothbrush that had somehow stayed in the cabinet all this time. He climbed into his old bed, sheets clean, a little stiff from disuse. Frank didn't read a story, but he sat beside him until the boy fell asleep. In the early hours, before the sun cracked open the sky, Daniel woke to the sound of the back door creaking shut. He padded out of bed, still barefoot, and peeked through the window. Frank was out there, moving through the mist. Coat zipped high, carrying something wrapped in a plastic bag. He ducked behind the barn. Curiosity got the better of him. Daniel slipped on his boots, grabbed his flannel, and followed. He moved quiet. the way you learn to in a house that's been too quiet too long. The grass was damp. The air smelled like pine needles and dirt. When he reached the side of the barn, he saw Frank unlock the old wooden gate that led to the far stall, the one they'd never used. The door creaked open. Frank stepped in. Daniel moved closer, his breath caught. Inside, barely lit by a hanging bulb, was something he couldn't name. It was smaller than a man, but not by much. Covered in brown fur, matted in places, thin in others. Its arms were long, curled in front of it like a scared child. Its face was wide, nose flat, eyes dark and glistening like wet ink. It didn't flinch when Frank approached. It didn't growl or cower. It reached. Frank knelt and handed it the bag. The creature took it gently, opened it, and began eating. Movements fast, but not frantic. Like it had done this before. Frank reached into his coat and pulled out a thermos cap, poured a little water, held it out. The creature drank. Daniel stepped on a loose board. The creature froze. Its head snapped toward the sound, eyes locking on Daniel's. Frank didn't move. Neither did Daniel. Then, impossibly, the creature stepped forward. Its gaze never left Daniel's. It tilted its head, took 1-2 careful steps, then reached out. Daniel wanted to run, but something kept him there. He watched as the hand, long fingers, padded palm, claws worn down, stretched toward him and touched his wrist, just once, just long enough to feel warm. Frank stood behind it, quiet. "This is Junior," he said. Daniel nodded. His voice didn't work. Frank reached for his shoulder. He needed someone, just like you did. The creature, Junior, made a soft sound, like a breath caught in a reed. Daniel looked into its eyes, and for the first time since Seattle, he didn't feel abandoned. He felt chosen. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside that barn, under the faded rafters and the old rope swing that had once held a saddle, 3 hearts beat in rhythm. One broken, one scarred, one wild, but all willing. Daniel didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight he wasn't lost. And something deep in the woods, older than fences, older than stories, had come home too. By the time the spring sun climbed high enough to dry the frost from the barn roof, the yard behind Frank's cabin had started to feel like a secret world, all its own. The land back there wasn't much, just a wide patch of hard earth framed by wild rye and oak, shaded by a massive, old southern live oak that looked older than the house itself. But to the 3 souls who lived in orbit around it, it might as well have been a whole country. Frank had spent the better part of 2 weeks building a fence high and tight around it. Not the kind of thing you could pick up from the hardware store, but a careful weave of timber and repurposed barn wood, 6 feet tall in every direction, no gaps at the bottom. He worked with the quiet determination of someone who knew exactly how much was at stake. Daniel helped where he could, holding nails between his teeth, handing over the hammer, steadying boards with arms that still trembled after a few minutes. Junior watched from a patch of sunlight, crouched low, arms around knees, his dark eyes never leaving Frank's hands. Once, when Frank misjudged a swing and hissed through his teeth, Junior let out a soft grunt and mimicked the motion, lifting a stick and tapping it twice on a fallen log, as if saying, "You missed a spot." That was the first time Daniel heard Frank laugh in months. By early June, the fence was done. A rough little gate with a sliding latch. The interior layered with hay and patches of soft moss that Junior took to lying on, stretched out like a dog sunbathing after rain. They didn't give him chores. He wasn't some pet, but there was a rhythm to things now. Daniel would fill a metal pail with well water in the mornings. Frank would leave out scraps of jerky or apples cut small. Sometimes Junior wouldn't eat until the sun dipped low, but other times, he'd yank the food from their hands and scurry off behind the shed, chewing with wild haste, then disappear into the shadows until dusk. His moods were his own, strange and tidal, but one thing remained constant. He never hurt them, not once. In that enclosure, Junior began to play. It started small. A pine cone rolled toward him. He sniffed it, tapped it once, then sent it skittering back with a sharp flick of his knuckle. Daniel giggled and rolled it again. This went on for an hour. The next day, it was a baseball, worn, seams fraying, that Daniel tossed underhand. Junior caught it with both hands, surprised, eyes wide. Then threw it too hard, straight over the fence, shattering a milk bottle on the other side. Frank didn't scold him. He just nodded and said, "Good arm." There was a rope swing, too, strung between two sturdy oak limbs. Daniel had forgotten it was there, left over from a time when his legs barely reached the ground. Junior found it one afternoon, ran toward it on all fours, then stood upright and leapt, grabbing the rope mid-air. He swung back and forth with such force the branches groaned. His mouth opened in what might have been a laugh, or a howl, or both. Daniel clapped from below, shouting, "That's it! Swing again!" And for a moment it felt like any other summer afternoon. Just two kids burning daylight, one barefoot and grinning, the other covered in fur and joy. But not everything could stay easy. They took turns reading in the evenings now. Frank's voice slow, clear, always pausing at the good parts. Daniel would lean in, his eyes flicking to Junior, who would sit curled at Frank's feet, eyes half closed, head resting on the old man's knee. His body trembled at times, not from fear, but like he was holding something in. Maybe memories, maybe instinct. Sometimes his hands would twitch in his sleep, as if dreaming of running through some forest none of them had ever seen. There was something sacred about those nights. No TV, no radio. Just firelight and the creak of wood, and a story to remind them they were still human, or something close to it. Once, Daniel asked Frank why he didn't call someone, why he didn't tell the university or the sheriff or even the newspaper. Frank just stared at the fire and said, "Son, some things lose their soul the moment you put them under a microscope, but the world doesn't always let you keep your secrets." It happened on a Thursday. Warm air, flies on the porch rail, the kind of day where the world feels like it's leaning forward. The neighbor, Mrs. Harrelson, had driven up to drop off a jar of blackberry preserves, something she did every summer out of habit, even if she and Frank didn't speak much beyond weather and fences. She stood at the edge of the porch, waiting while Frank fetched her change from the kitchen. Her gaze drifted across the field, toward the back of the house, toward the fence. Junior had been climbing, nothing dramatic, just using his long limbs to shuffle up the trunk of the oak, then back down again. Over and over, training maybe, or playing. But his silhouette, large and oddly shaped, moved just enough in the sun to catch the eye. Mrs. Harrelson squinted. Frank stepped out, change in hand, just as she said, half joking, "You got yourself a new pet back there, Frank? That shadow looked bigger than a cow." Frank smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a sick mule I'm boarding for a feller out in High-and-Palm. Ugly as sin, but harmless." She laughed politely, but her head tilted. Just slightly, like a woman tucking a question away for later. That night, Frank reinforced the back gate, added another plank, hammered quietly, but his knuckles were white around the handle. Daniel sat on the porch steps, watching. He didn't say what they were both thinking, but the air had shifted. That kind of shift that comes before the first crack of thunder, like something was leaning just a little too hard against the walls of their peace. Junior picked up on it. He stayed closer to Frank that night, watched him patch the fence, watched the way his eyes scanned the horizon. When the sun went down, he didn't swing or roll the baseball. He just sat, hunched, back to the barn wall, fingers curling and uncurling in the dirt. Daniel brought him a blanket. Junior didn't take it, but when Daniel placed it down beside him, the creature reached over and touched the edge with 2 fingers, then held very still. They slept uneasy. Frank stayed up, his silhouette visible through the kitchen window, moving slow, thinking. Daniel dreamed of glass shattering, of Junior running, of headlights and sirens and someone screaming. The next morning, the air smelled like something broken. The ryegrass bent low. Even the birds stayed quiet. Junior didn't come out of his shed until nearly noon, and when he did, he moved different, slower, listening more than playing. Daniel sat with him by the fence, tossed the baseball once. Junior didn't throw it back. "Hey," Daniel whispered. "It's okay, we're okay." Junior looked at him. Not like a child, not even like an animal, but like someone who knew exactly what the stakes were. That afternoon, Frank came out with a book under one arm. He didn't sit, just stood in the doorway and said, "Let's read inside tonight." They did. Junior didn't sit at his feet. He stood in the corner, listened, watched, and when the last page turned, and the fire burned low, and the wind began to rattle the loose pane in the back window, Daniel looked across the room and understood for the first time that secrets weren't just delicate. They were doomed the moment someone else caught their shadow. And somewhere in the silence between chapters, somewhere deep in Junior's eyes, something old was stirring. Not angry, not wild, but waiting for the world to come knocking. It had rained through the night. Not the kind of soft drizzle that whispered on rooftops, but a hard, stamping kind of rain that drove deep into the bones of the valley. By morning, the world looked waterlogged. Tree trunks darkened like ink stains, ground soft enough to swallow boot heels whole. The Trinity Alps loomed like watchful giants under a gray sky, their shoulders shrouded in mist and cloud. The maple trees along the ridgeline had just begun to turn, fiery reds, deep rusted oranges, the gold of dying light. Daniel, now 12, stood at the edge of the porch, laces wet from puddles, backpack slung loose on one shoulder. Frank had warned him not to go too far, especially after a storm, but Daniel had made up his mind. He looked back at the screen door, half expecting it to creak open, to hear his father's voice calling him back with that quiet kind of warning he never had to raise above a whisper. But the house was still. Inside, Frank sat with Junior, nursing the creature's injured wrist, just a sprain from jumping too far off the shed roof the day before. Frank said he'd be fine. Daniel had waited until Junior fell asleep in the corner of the kitchen, his breath slow and heavy, hand still cradled in that awkward, half-human way. Now he moved fast. Across the side yard, through the fence gate, into the woods behind the property where the trail curved down into the lower groves. The air was cold and wet. Every branch dripped. His boots slipped twice before he even reached the first clearing. But something in him burned. Maybe it was the cabin fever of too many months keeping Junior hidden. Maybe it was the fact that Frank hadn't let him explore with Junior past the fence, hadn't trusted how much the creature understood. Or maybe Daniel was chasing something even he couldn't name. A chance to feel big again, older, brave. Junior had never seen the forest properly. Not the deep parts, not the creeks with smooth stones that looked like dinosaur eggs, or the soft, spongy clearings where deer bedded down at night. Daniel knew the paths. He knew where to go, and Junior had followed. He hadn't meant for it to happen. But no more than 5 minutes down the trail, Daniel heard the quiet shift behind him. He turned, and there he was, perched between two mossy trunks, silent as smoke, those wide black eyes blinking in the low light. His fur was damp, a twig stuck out of one shoulder. Daniel sighed. "You weren't supposed to come." Junior tilted his head. Daniel stared at him a moment longer, then turned. "Fine, but stay close." And for once, Junior did. The path narrowed, twisting through patches of vine maple and fallen fir. Junior moved like he belonged to the woods, almost gliding over mud and root. Daniel had to scramble in places where Junior vaulted easily, climbing rocks like stairs, pulling himself up by trees with long, careful fingers. He never once looked afraid. Instead, he looked alive. His nostrils flared at the smell of wet bark. His ears turned at every sound. At one point he paused, crouched low, and sniffed a clump of fresh coyote scat. then looked up at Daniel like he was waiting for some explanation. Daniel just shook his head. Yeah, that's gross. By late morning, the sky had darkened again. Clouds pressing low, wind pushing through the ridges like something searching for a way in. They reached the edge of a slope Daniel had only explored once, where a narrow ravine sliced through the woods and opened into a creek lined with slippery rocks and old cedar roots. The water down there was running faster than usual, fed by last night's storm. Daniel hesitated at the top. Junior stood beside him, posture alert. "You ever seen water move like that?" Daniel asked, but not expecting an answer. Junior stepped closer to the edge, crouched and watched. Daniel knew better than to cross the ravine today. The moss would be slick, the rocks barely holding, but Junior leapt. It wasn't reckless. It was graceful, like a deer bounding over a fence. He landed on the far side in a crouch, hair soaked, hands splayed against the earth. Then he stood and looked back at Daniel. Daniel stared, heart pounding. "Okay," he whispered to himself. "Your turn." He took a step back, got a running start, and jumped. His boot slipped mid-air. The edge of the opposite bank crumbled beneath him. For one terrible second, he hovered between landing and falling, then hit the mud hard, slid sideways, and dropped into the creek with a sound that sucked the breath from his chest. The water was freezing, strong. It twisted him fast, dragging him down along the current. His knees hit rock. His elbow caught a jagged root. He tried to scream but swallowed a mouthful of muddy runoff. His eyes stung. He reached for anything. Nothing held. The forest spun. The sky disappeared. Then something clamped around his wrist. He felt it before he saw it. A grip, tight, rough, but sure. Junior. Daniel's head broke the surface just long enough to gasp before he was yanked toward the bank. His shoulder nearly popped from the socket. His boots scraped on gravel. Junior had both hands on him now, dragging him up the slope like a rag doll. Once clear of the water, Daniel coughed hard, spit mud, and lay face down in the moss. Junior knelt beside him, one hand still gripping his soaked jacket. Daniel turned his head. "Thanks," he rasped. Junior looked at him, then back toward the water. Then something shifted in his posture. His breathing slowed. His head turned, sharp and deliberate, toward the far tree line. His nostrils flared again. "What is it?" Daniel asked, pushing himself up on one elbow. Junior didn't answer, because standing there, half hidden behind a veil of red maple leaves and the thin threads of lingering rain, was something else. Taller than Frank, broader than Junior. Still, watching, the figure stood perfectly motionless, like it had been there long before they arrived. Its outline blurred in the rain and shifting mist, but Daniel saw the shape of its shoulders, the long arms, the heaviness of its chest. Hair clung wet to its limbs. It didn't make a sound, not even when Junior stood and faced it. The two stared across the ravine. Seconds stretched. Daniel didn't dare move. His heart pounded behind his ribs like a drum in a narrow room. Then, just as silently as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the trees. No crack of branch, no splash, just gone. Junior didn't follow. He stood there for a long time, shoulders drawn tight, arms low. Then he looked back at Daniel, and in his eyes, wide, dark, shimmering with rain, Daniel saw something that changed everything. Recognition? He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He couldn't find the words anyway. They didn't speak on the walk home. Junior moved slower now, more cautious, as if the woods weren't his alone anymore, as if something larger had stepped back into the space he'd been allowed to fill. When they reached the fence, Daniel climbed through first. Junior hesitated, one hand on the top rail. He turned his head, eyes still scanning the tree line behind them. Frank met them at the porch. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. One look at Daniel's soaked clothes and scraped arms told him everything. But when his eyes met Junior's, and something in Frank's shoulders tensed, Daniel knew his father had seen something like this before. Maybe not today, maybe not recently, but before. Later that night, after Daniel had washed up and Junior had curled on the blanket near the stove, Frank poured a drink he didn't sip. Daniel stood in the kitchen doorway. "There's more of them, isn't there?" he asked quietly. Frank stared at the window, where the rain had begun again. Gentle this time. After a long silence, he said, "I think so." Daniel looked at Junior, sleeping now, hand twitching in his dreams. And for the first time he wondered, was Junior ever truly alone? Outside, the trees whispered with wind. And deep in the woods, where light rarely touched, something watched, something remembered, something waited. The first hard frost came early that year. One morning in late November, Daniel woke to find the window pane crusted in lacy ice, each breath leaving a fog in the air as he pulled his blanket tighter. Outside, the grass had stiffened into brittle stalks, and the porch steps groaned like tired bones under the weight of cold. Inside the cabin, the stove was already burning. Frank had been up for hours, hands black with ash, moving like a man who knew winter was more than a season. It was something to prepare for. Junior had grown bigger, not taller in any remarkable way, but denser, heavier around the shoulders, voice deeper in his chest. His fur had thickened for the cold, bristling up at the neck, and his movements had changed. Less bouncing, more stalking. Some mornings, Daniel caught him pacing in the yard, shoulders hunched, fingers twitching. Other days, he'd vanish for hours behind the tool shed, crouched in silence, staring at nothing. He still came to the porch in the evenings, still nestled beside the fire when Frank read aloud, still caught Daniel's eye with the old familiar gaze of trust. But there was something brewing behind those dark eyes now, something Daniel didn't have words for. They first noticed it after a night when coyotes howled too close. Daniel had woken with a start, hearing the fence rattle. By the time he reached the back door, Junior was gone. Frank followed the tracks with a flashlight and a loaded rifle, his face pale beneath his beard. They found Junior at the tree line, standing over the torn carcass of a buck. The kill was clean. Too clean. The throat opened, ribs exposed, but no mess. No feeding, just blood cooling in the snow. Junior stood still beside it, breathing hard, eyes locked on the treetops. Frank said nothing, just turned and walked back toward the house. Daniel stayed behind a moment longer, heart racing, unsure whether to be proud or afraid. That was the first time he realized the creature they had raised like a child might not stay a child forever. The days grew shorter. Frank reinforced the fencing again, replaced the locks on the barn, left tools inside at night instead of the shed. He wasn't saying it out loud, but Daniel could feel it in every gesture. Frank was worried. Then came the scratching. One night in late January, Daniel woke to a scraping sound just outside his window. Not sharp, not wild, but slow, measured. He crept across the floor, bare feet freezing, and pulled the curtain back. In the moonlight, Junior was standing inches from the glass, eyes glazed, fingers dragging slowly down the pane. His mouth hung open, breath fogging the glass. Daniel opened the window a crack. "Hey," he whispered, "you okay?" Junior blinked. Slowly, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark like a shadow sliding off a wall. The next morning, Frank found claw marks on the back door frame. Deep, angry. Junior didn't come near the porch that day. He paced near the fence instead, arms swinging, shoulders twitching. Frank watched him from the kitchen window, arms crossed. "He's calling," Frank said quietly. Daniel looked up from his bowl of cereal. "Calling who?" Frank didn't answer. By February, the rumors had started. One of the ranchers up north claimed he'd lost a calf. No sign of a break-in. No tracks. Just a bent gate and blood on the straw. Then another rancher mentioned strange howls near the river bend. Frank stayed quiet at the feed store, nodding, keeping his eyes low. But Daniel saw how his father's hands gripped the steering wheel harder on the drive home. The town sheriff stopped by one evening, said they were checking on livestock reports. Frank invited him in, offered coffee. Daniel sat stiff on the couch, watching as Frank handed over a stack of papers, notes, photographs. "He's an injured animal," Frank said calmly. "Some kind of foreign primate. Someone tried to keep him illegally. We're just nursing him through winter." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Foreign? South American," Frank lied without blinking. "But he's harmless. Stays in the pen, sedated as needed." The sheriff took his time flipping through the folder. Daniel held his breath, but in the end, the man closed it with a shrug and handed it back. "Long as it stays in the pen," but it wasn't staying anymore. One night, Daniel woke to barking. Not wild barking, structured. The way Junior had started vocalizing when agitated. Low barks, spaced apart, rising at the end like a question. Frank was already at the window, rifle in hand. They stepped outside together, cold, biting their skin. Junior stood at the far side of the enclosure, staring into the woods, his body rigid, breathing heavy. He barked again, louder, then waited. Nothing. Then, faint, distant, but clear, something barked back. Not a coyote, not a dog. Something deep, something old. Junior made a choking sound and punched the fence post so hard it splintered. Then he dropped to all fours and ran circles around the yard, snarling. Frank called his name. Junior didn't stop. Daniel stepped closer, hands raised. Hey, buddy, it's okay, we're here." Junior dropped to a crouch, eyes wild, lips pulled back, his chest heaving. Frank stepped between them. "Back in the house, now." Daniel obeyed. But through the window, he saw Frank kneel beside Junior, whisper something, rest a hand on his shoulder. For a long time, they stayed like that, motionless in the freezing dark. A week later, the phone rang. No caller ID. Frank answered. Daniel stood nearby, watching. Frank listened, face blank. Then slowly lowered the receiver. "Wrong number," he said. But Daniel had heard it too. The voice. Female, familiar. The way she'd said his name. "Franklin, you have something that doesn't belong to you." Frank hung up without another word. Daniel didn't sleep that night. The wind was loud, and every time it creaked the siding, he imagined eyes in the dark. The next afternoon, a patrol car rolled up the gravel drive. Deputy Owen Gale stepped out, hat low, boots muddy. "Oh, we got a report," he said. "Something unusual on your property." Frank didn't move. "Like what?" Owen squinted past him. "Caller said they saw something big. Not a bear, not a man either." Daniel's heart pounded. Frank opened the barn door, showed him the same pens, the same feeding schedule, the same stack of fabricated documents from before. Owen looked through them, frowning. "You got all the right papers, Frank. But some folks out here get nervous real easy. I'd keep that thing locked up tight. You understand?" Frank nodded. "Always do." When the cruiser pulled away, Daniel asked, "That voice on the phone, was it her?" Frank didn't answer right away. Just lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years. "I don't know," he finally said. "But someone wants him gone." That night, Daniel crept to the back shed where Junior slept. He found him crouched in the corner, arms wrapped tight around his knees, rocking slowly. "Hey," Daniel whispered. "I'm not gonna let them take you." Junior looked up. His face was different now, less like a boy, more like something stuck between worlds. He reached out, gripped Daniel's wrist. Hard. "Stay," he croaked. It was the first time he'd spoken a real word. Daniel's throat closed. "I will," he said. "I swear." But outside, deep in the trees, something knocked. 3 times. Not wind, not branches. A rhythm. Junior flinched. Daniel froze. And somewhere, beneath the weight of frost and silence, the forest held its breath. By mid-July, the air in Trinity County had turned thick and electric. The sky held its breath every afternoon. waiting for something to crack it open. It was wildfire season again, earlier than usual. The mountains to the west were already coughing black into the clouds, and the smell of smoke settled into every crack of the old cabin, beneath door frames, inside pillowcases, woven into the folds of blankets that hadn't been washed in weeks. Frank kept the radio low, AM static between updates, his eyes flicking to the window every few minutes as if watching for a storm that wouldn't show itself in rain but in orange flames and the ghostly stutter of emergency lights. Daniel knew the signs now. He was 16, not a boy anymore. His hands were calloused, his voice had dropped, but the knot in his chest, the one he'd been carrying since Junior first appeared in the barn stall, had grown with him. And this summer, it wouldn't settle. Junior had changed too. He was full grown now, massive, taller than Frank by nearly a foot, arms thick with muscle but still moving like smoke when he wanted to disappear. But the fire did something to him, something that couldn't be calmed with a story or a gentle voice. He paced constantly, shoulders hunched, breath coming in short gasps. His eyes stayed wide even in daylight. And when the ash finally began falling like snow across the valley, he let out a sound no one had ever heard before, high, keening, broken. He slammed into the side of the barn hard enough to crack a beam. Frank was there in seconds, hands up, voice low. But Junior didn't want comfort. He wanted space. He wanted out. Daniel stood near the woodpile, heart pounding, watching his father try to calm something that couldn't be calmed. The smoke was thicker that day. The wind brought it in waves that stung their eyes and dried out their throats. The sky had turned a dirty gold, and the sun looked sick behind it. Frank turned to Daniel. "We can't keep him here, not like this." Daniel didn't answer right away. He'd already been thinking the same thing. Junior had stopped sleeping. He stayed curled behind the shed, rocking, scratching at the dirt until his nails split. He wasn't just afraid. He was unraveling. "He needs cover," Frank said. "Something deeper in." "Back in the forest?" Frank nodded. "There's a spot past the South Ridge. Deep. No trails. I used to take horses there during dry spells. Has water, rock outcrops. He might feel safer." Daniel knew the place. He also knew it meant letting Junior out without a leash, without a fence, without protection. But he saw the way Junior trembled now, eyes darting toward the horizon like something was calling him from just beyond the tree line. They left that evening right before sunset. Frank packed 2 canteens, a flashlight, jerky wrapped in foil, a wool blanket, and a knife he never said out loud was for protection. Junior didn't resist. He followed them like a soldier, his steps heavy, his breathing erratic. When the trail narrowed, he moved ahead, pushing through ferns and branches like they weren't there. The smoke followed them even into the deep woods, clinging to leaves, coloring everything in gray. It took almost an hour to reach the spot, a wide clearing framed by granite and shadow, with a dry stream bed that still held cool air even in heat. Junior sat against the largest stone and didn't move for several minutes. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts. Then he let out a soft moan, buried his head in his arms, and stayed like that while the light died around them. Daniel crouched beside him. "I'll stay tonight," he said. Frank didn't argue. They set a small fire using damp wood. It didn't give off much smoke, but enough for warmth. Junior didn't sleep. Daniel didn't either. Sometime after midnight, Junior began to hum. Not a tune, just a low sound that moved like breath over a bottle's mouth. It rose and fell, soft and trembling. And for the first time, Daniel saw something fall down Junior's cheek. Not sweat, not water. A single tear sliding through the fur, catching on the edge of his jaw. Frank reached out. Not to pet, not to soothe, just to touch. Junior didn't flinch. By morning they returned home, but only Daniel and Frank went back. Junior stayed in the forest. The days that followed were quiet. Frank didn't say much. He kept the barn doors closed, even when there was nothing inside. The chair on the porch stayed empty. Daniel found himself listening for the scrape of nails on wood, for the deep breath of something larger than a man shifting in the dark. But it never came. Each night, the fires grew closer. One ridge, then another. The sky never turned blue again. Then one afternoon, as they were boarding up the west window, a car pulled up. Dust rolled in behind the tires. The engine ticked. The door opened. It was Martha. Daniel hadn't seen her in almost 5 years. She looked different, and exactly the same. Hair shorter, jaw sharper. The same necklace she always wore, turquoise and brass, resting against a shirt too clean for a place like this. Her boots were new. She stood at the bottom step of the porch and didn't smile. "I heard there's an animal here," she said. "Something not legal." Frank didn't blink. "Where'd you hear that?" "Does it matter?" Daniel came to the door. Her eyes flicked toward him, then softened. "You've gotten taller," she said. He didn't answer. Frank crossed his arms. "You don't get to come here and—" "I want custody," she cut in. Silence. "I've got a lawyer in Eureka," she said. "If you've got an undocumented creature on your property and a minor child living here, it's not hard to build a case." Frank stepped down the porch. The air between them went cold, despite the heat. "You left." "I had reasons." "You always do." She took a breath, then looked at Daniel. "It's not safe here. You know that? I can take you. We'll find a school, a proper home." Daniel stared at her for a long time. Then he said, without raising his voice, "No." She didn't move. I said no. Frank looked at her again. "He decides." You heard him. Martha's mouth twitched. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Then she turned and got in her car. Drove off without another word. The dust from her tires hung in the air long after the sound disappeared. They stood there in silence until Frank finally muttered, "She never did like animals." Daniel laughed once, short and bitter. That night, a white truck with county markings rolled past the property. Didn't stop, didn't slow. But it looked. 2 nights later, it came back. Daniel saw the headlights crawl along the dirt road, casting long shadows across the trees. This time it stopped. The engine idled. A figure got out, walked halfway up the drive, then turned, got back in, drove away. Daniel didn't sleep. At dawn, he went back to the ridge. Junior was still there. He'd made a nest of sorts. Branches, ferns, an old tarp Frank had left years ago. His eyes were calmer, but his breathing was still shallow. "They know," Daniel whispered. Junior didn't react. Daniel sat beside him, knees to chest. "They're coming." Junior looked up, then leaned forward, and for the first time since they met, pressed his forehead to Daniel's. The boy didn't move. Behind them, the forest stayed quiet, but somewhere beneath the smoke in the trees, the world was shifting, edging closer, and neither of them could stop it now. It started with a sound Daniel couldn't place. Not wind, not rain, just a rhythm beneath the quiet, like breathing, but strained. When he opened the back door, the smell of rot was everywhere, thick and damp, as if the forest itself had turned inward. The ground was soft with early autumn leaves, the air brittle with cold. He followed the path behind the shed without thinking, pulling his coat tighter, stepping lightly. The light was thin, filtered through the last of the yellowing maples, and in the dimness, everything felt far away. He found Junior in the hollow under the twin oaks, curled on his side, spine arched, one massive arm across his ribs. His chest rose with difficulty, each breath shallow. Daniel dropped to his knees. The dirt was wet, smelled like copper. Junior's eyes were open, but they didn't track the way they used to. They looked at nothing. "Dad!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. Frank came running. No boots, no coat. Just the flannel he'd worn to bed and his hands already shaking before he saw anything. He dropped beside Junior, brushed leaves from his brow. "Talk to me. What happened?" But Junior didn't speak. His mouth moved, barely. No sound came. Only that deep, irregular breath, and the occasional twitch of fingers too tired to hold on. Frank placed a hand on his chest, counted, felt the collapse of ribs too loose. A chill set in, deeper than the cold. Daniel had seen animals die before, calves, dogs, even a wounded hawk Frank once tried to save. But none of them like this. This was slow, like the body wanted to stay, but something was pulling from the inside. Frank pressed a damp cloth to Junior's lips, tried to coax him to drink. "Come on, boy, stay with me, you're okay." But Junior didn't drink. Daniel sat back, arms around his knees. He couldn't stop staring at the curve of Junior's ribs, the way they barely moved now, the way his fingers dug into the soil like he was trying to hold himself to the earth. "What happened?" he asked. Frank didn't look up. "I don't know." They stayed with him until sunset. Frank wouldn't leave, not to eat, not to warm up. He just kept talking, soft and steady, like Junior could still hear every word. Sometimes he told old stories, about the first night they met, about the time Junior climbed onto the roof and refused to come down for 3 hours. Daniel listened, said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. Not anymore. It was dark when the breathing stopped. No gasp, no flinch. Just a long exhale that didn't come back. Frank leaned over, hands on either side of Junior's face, forehead pressed to the fur. For a moment, the air held. Then he let out a sound Daniel had never heard from his father. Not even when Martha left. Not when the fires came. A broken sound, like something deep inside him had cracked open and didn't know how to close again. He held Junior for a long time. When he finally stood, his hands trembled. "We'll bury him here," he said, "where he can see the sky." Daniel nodded. They worked by lantern light. The soil beneath the oaks was soft, but deep-rooted. Each shovelful dragged. Frank's shoulders moved like they were carrying more than the weight of dirt. Daniel's palms blistered. The smell of moss and old bark mixed with sweat and something else. Something like grief, if it had a scent. They laid Junior on the blanket they used to sit on for stories. Frank wrapped it tight, as if the cold could still reach him. Then, carefully, reverently, they lowered him down. Frank placed a piece of the old wool rug on his chest. Daniel added the red bandana he used to tie around Junior's wrist, back when they played tag in the yard. Neither of them spoke when the dirt began to fall. When it was done, Frank knelt beside the fresh mound. He whispered, "Don't be scared, you're not alone now." Then he stayed there, unmoving, as the wind picked up and the leaves began to fall. Later, long after midnight, Daniel returned alone. The lantern cast a pale ring of gold over the grave. The trees swayed above, their branches sighing in the wind. Daniel sat beside the mound, arms wrapped around himself. He didn't cry, but something in his chest had gone very quiet. He sat there for what felt like hours, watching the trees, and that's when he heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, distant. They came from the woods beyond the oaks, from the deeper thicket where even the deer didn't wander. He turned his head, heart thudding. The steps grew closer, then stopped. Silence, then nothing. He waited. But whoever or whatever it was didn't come any closer. Just silence again. He stood slowly, looked into the dark. "Is someone there?" The silence answered. He didn't run. He just listened. To the wind, to the night, to whatever stillness had settled over the land now that something wild and good had left it. When he finally turned to go, he looked back once more at the grave. Something had shifted. A single cedar branch had been placed at the foot of the mound. Fresh, not from the oaks above, from deeper in the woods. Daniel stared at it, his breath catching. Then he looked up toward the trees, where the night held its breath. And in that breath, he understood. Junior was never alone. Not truly. And now, neither was his memory. Something watched from the woods, and something mourned, too. It had been years since anyone walked up that dirt road without knowing exactly where it ended. The old cabin was still standing, though the shutters hung loose now and the chimney leaned a little farther each winter. Grass had overtaken the path around the side, swallowing the woodpile and curling up through the porch steps. One of the twin oaks in the back had lost a limb in a storm, The other held on, still wide and strong, its roots thick beneath the moss. Daniel stood there with one hand resting on the gatepost, eyes scanning the place like he was trying to fit a memory back into a body that didn't wear it the same anymore. The summer air in the Trinity Alps still carried that heavy sweetness, pine sap and sunburnt earth. It hit him the second he stepped out of the car. That smell never changed. No matter how many cities he'd lived in, how many winters passed, how many years it had been since he buried his father and left this place behind. The smell alone brought it all back. The rope swing, the flicker of a flashlight against the barn door, the sound of Frank's boots on the porch in the blue light of morning. He hadn't come here to stay. Not really. Just to visit. A few days, maybe. But he'd brought the box with him. The one he kept in the back of the closet, wrapped in an old flannel shirt that still faintly held the scent of cedar and wood smoke. Inside was the little whittled pine carving he and Frank had started together. A shape that was supposed to become a dog, but had turned into something else. The belly was too wide, the legs uneven. The face didn't look like any real animal. But it had always reminded Daniel of Junior. Not what he looked like exactly, but the feeling of him. The way he tilted his head when he didn't understand. The way his fingers curled like they were always halfway between taking and letting go. Daniel knelt in the tall grass near the old grave. The dirt had settled years ago, covered now in fallen oak leaves and stubborn weeds. No marker, no cross, just the memory of that night and the way the forest had gone quiet after. He cleared the space with his hands, wiped away the moss. Then he placed the carving down and sat back on his heels. He didn't speak at first. There was no need. The trees whispered around him. The breeze carried something low and patient through the branches. He could feel the quiet press against his skin like an old coat that still fit. He stayed like that for a while, not measuring time, just breathing. When he finally stood, he didn't look back at the cabin right away. He looked at the tree line beyond the grave, where shadows always seemed to move a little longer, where he used to imagine Junior's family watching from a distance, never quite showing themselves, never truly gone. He wondered if they still came, if they left gifts, the way that cedar branch appeared the night Junior died. Maybe they still listened. Maybe they remembered. Back inside, the house hadn't changed much. Dust on the windowsills. A faded photograph of Frank tucked in the bookshelf behind an empty mason jar. Daniel picked it up. The picture wasn't framed, just curled at the corners, creased in the middle. Frank stood with one hand on a shovel, the other resting on Daniel's shoulder. Behind them, out of focus, was the outline of something tall and furred, barely visible between the trees. He remembered the day the photo was taken. How Junior had stepped out just long enough to watch, then disappeared before the camera clicked again. Frank had lasted another year after Junior passed. He moved slower after that. The mornings took longer. His hands stiffened. Daniel had stayed as long as he could, but the weight of the place started to rot him from the inside. When Frank finally passed in the summer of '90, Daniel didn't cry. He just sat on the porch for hours after the body was taken away, staring at the gravel road, wondering if he'd see a silhouette come out of the trees one last time. Nothing ever did. He hadn't returned until now, and yet, the moment he stepped into the back room, the one where Junior used to sleep curled beside the wood stove, he felt something settle back into place, like the house had been waiting, not in grief, but in stillness, holding space. He spent the rest of the afternoon clearing the garden out back. The old tomato cages were rusted through, but the soil still turned soft beneath the hoe. The crows circled once or twice, low and curious. A fox crossed the path near sundown, pausing to watch him before vanishing into the brush. That night he sat alone on the porch. The stars were still good out here, no streetlights, no traffic hum, just the cicadas and the breath of trees. He took the old whittled carving out of his pocket, rubbed his thumb over the uneven edges. Frank used to say, "Every good thing ends the same way. We let go or we hold on too long." Daniel never understood what that meant when he was a boy. But he did now. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant showing up again. It meant standing in the same place and breathing the same air and saying, without words, I'm still here. I remember. In the morning, he'd head back to town. Maybe sell the place. Maybe not. But for tonight, he let the silence stretch. He let the night carry the weight. And somewhere deep in the forest, where no one else would hear, something knocked once, then again, and then the wind carried it away. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones written in books or shouted across headlines. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, told through glances, shared silence, the way someone stays even when it's hard. They live in backwoods cabins, in rusted fences and overgrown gardens, in the soft hush of trees that remember more than we do. These stories don't ask for attention. They ask for presence, for a hand reached out in the dark, for trust that grows not from words, but from the simple, steady act of care. There is something deeply human in loving what the world doesn't understand, in choosing kindness when it costs you something, in holding space for the misunderstood, the misnamed, the hidden. Not every bond needs a name to be real. Not every life needs to be loud to leave a mark. Some connections echo longer because they were never spoken, only felt, across time, across fear, across what we think we know. And maybe that's the quiet truth underneath it all, that compassion doesn't require reason, that you don't have to be the same to belong, that home isn't always built with walls, but with memory, with care, with the courage to stay when everything tells you to run. Some goodbyes aren't endings. They're beginnings wrapped in silence, handed back to the earth like seeds. So, wherever you are tonight, whether you're surrounded by people or sitting alone with your thoughts, know this: even in your stillness, even in your questions, there is something out there that sees you. Something that understands what it means to carry loss and still offer love. Thank you for being here, for listening all the way to the end. If this story moved you in some way, if it reminded you of someone or something, or a moment you thought was long gone, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your memories, or simply a word that stayed with you. And if you'd like to stay connected, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and share this with someone who might need a story tonight. Until next time, be gentle, stay curious, and never stop believing that even the quietest hearts leave footprints.